Olá, sejam bem-vindos. Hoje vamos conversar com a professora Mary Beard sobre seu novo livro lançado no Brasil pela Todavia, Os Doze Césares. Uma muito bem cuidada edição, toda ilustrada, uma prosa irresistível que preserva o estilo das concorridas palestras que ela fez na National Gallery em Washington em 2014. Professor Mary Beard nasceu na Inglaterra em 1955 e é uma das mais importantes e renomadas classicistas da atualidade. Especialista em história romana e história da arte, ela é professora na Universidade de Cambridge e autora de best-sellers como Uma História da Roma Antiga e Mulheres e Poder, um Manifesto. Mary Beard é uma famosa apresentadora de TV na Inglaterra, responsável por divulgar e popularizar o gosto pela história. É um exemplo de intelectual que, para além dos muros da universidade, está sempre discutindo avidamente com seus leitores nas redes sociais, no Twitter em especial. Neste livro, ela conta a história de como, ao longo de mais de 2000 anos, os ricos, famosos e poderosos foram retratados aos moldes dos imperadores romanos. Doze Césares faz uma pergunta fundamental. Por que esses autocratas impactaram tanto a arte do Renascimento até os dias de hoje? Professor Mary Beard, what a pleasure to have you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So you gave the classics a huge public engagement and interest. So as a first question, why do the classics matter and what can we learn from the past?
Well, the classics matter, I think, because they're still all around us. You know, one of the things that the book on the 12 Caesars does is say, look, we're still representing them. We still see them in cartoons, in our newspapers. You know, almost everybody across the world recognizes Nero playing his lyre while Rome burns behind him. And so I think that they matter because they're with us. They're part of our world. We still read them, we still translate them. And even when we don't think we do, I mean, we live in a world in which we talk about July and August being two of the summer months. And I think quite a lot of people forget that those months were named after Julius Caesar and the Emperor Augustus. So I think they're with us. That's why they matter. I mean, can we learn anything from them? I think we can learn to look at ourselves a bit harder. One thing I don't think that ancient Rome has lessons for us. I don't think we can find the solutions to our problems in ancient Rome, but I think we can think about our own problems a bit harder if we look at ancient Rome.
Great. So let's just start from the beginning. The title, The 12 Caesars. This is a very particular group of Roman emperors. Why these guys for this book?
Well, I chose the title because it is the title of a series of biographies by a Roman biographer living in the 2nd century AD called Suetonius. And he wrote a set of the life histories of the first 12 Roman emperors, counting Julius Caesar to start with. So he goes from Julius Caesar, who is assassinated in 44 BC, up to Domitian, who is assassinated, a lot of them are assassinated, in 96 AD. In the Renaissance, they became the kind of canonical group of the Roman emperors, the 12 Caesars. Caesar is really another word for emperor. And they were the most famous, were the most reproduced and painted, made into sculpture. They're not the only ones by any means. There's dozens of Roman emperors, but they became a kind of an early set, and that's why I chose to look at them in particular.
You mentioned Suetonius. Do you think that Suetonius himself was influenced by busts and other visual art, as well as the written texts that were available to him?
He might have been, and I think what's very puzzling actually about Suetonius is he does give quite detailed descriptions of what some of these emperors looked like. Now, Augustus has got black teeth, and an awful lot of them have got terrible spots. What is fascinating is that the busts that have survived of these emperors don't make them look anything like what Suetonius says and suggests. So he must have known that there was a big gap between his kind of description of these emperors and how they appeared in bronze and marble in the Roman world. And quite why that gap exists is still a bit puzzling, but in part it's because the sculptures are showing an official image rather than a real image. I mean, it's a bit like if you live in Britain, our queen looks a little bit like how she does on coins, but only a little bit like. They don't show her, looking 95 or whatever she is. They show her a bit younger and just a bit prettier.
Great. In the first chapters of the book, we are introduced to several episodes in which a representation of this Caesar that we thought was authentic turns out to be a forgery, and many of them were exhibited in important museums before being ostracized. So my question is it possible to assess the authenticity of these representations over time?
It's much, much harder than you ever imagine. I mean, one thing that makes all this puzzling for a start is that most of the busts that we have of Roman emperors, most of the sculptures are not named. They don't come with Julius Caesar inscribed underneath. So that's a bit of a puzzle to start with. But I think the other thing is that it is very hard to tell a fake or an imitation from a real ancient sculpture. And that's partly because sculptors in the 1st century AD were using much the same tools as sculptors in the 17th century AD. They were using the same kinds of marble, and they were producing, using traditional techniques, works of art that look very, very like each other. And people often imagine it must be terribly easy to tell a really ancient sculpture from one that is created 1,500 years later, but actually it isn't. And there are still quite a few where we still don't really know whether they are ancient or modern, or we don't know whether they're ancient with a bit of modern reworking. So they're kind of partly ancient.
And I think that there is a very important question that is why these emperors have such an impact on art from the Renaissance to the present day.
Yeah, I mean, that is really one of the puzzles that got me started on the book, because I've spent most of my life, as you said in your introduction, I work on the real ancient world, on the actual classical world. And I suddenly thought, but why is it that so many of the representations I look at, so many of the images of the Caesars, are in fact made in the Renaissance or later? And in part, it's because they were people and images with a life story that was really interesting to think about. If you wanted to think about corruption and the nature of power, they were your men, honestly. They gave you an image of transgression, sometimes good rulership, but very often corruption, luxury, and whatever. They were very good for people to kind of think with. And I think that people invested in puzzling about their success or their lack of success, or why they survived or why they got killed. So I don't think they were always put up because we admired them. It'd be quite hard to admire Caligula or Nero. They're put up because they help us think about power that's larger than life.
You mentioned Nero. Is it correct to say that the study of these representations can change our view of these emperors over time? For example, Nero. What did we learn from this representation about him? Is he as nasty today as he were a century ago, for example?
Well, it is very interesting that you see artists over the last few hundred years making different selections out of the stories of these emperors to represent sometimes in paint, sometimes in marble. And Nero is a great case because if we go back to the late Middle Ages, to the 14th, 15th centuries, one of the most popular images of Nero then was a really horrible, gruesome scene of Nero, who had killed his mother, Agrippina, having her body dissected. And you see Nero sometimes in these rather beautiful illustrations, but there's the emperor watching his mother being cut open, and he's got a glass of wine in his hand. Now, I don't think now that's a particularly popular image of the Emperor Nero. What people have done, what artists have tended to represent more recently in the last 200 years or so, is Nero who's a kind of tortured tyrant. There's a wonderful picture by a British artist called Waterhouse, J.W. Waterhouse, which also goes back to the story that Nero killed his mother, but it shows Nero in terrible remorse after he's done this. And there's Nero, who's not much more than a teenager then, lying on his bed, just obviously feeling absolutely dreadful, but looking very much like a sort of sulking teenager that we recognize even now, I think. So they do pick out different elements from the story.
I would like to talk a little bit about your book, Woman and Power. Brilliant last book before this one. We see that there are no empresses, but there are wives, mothers, and daughters who have important roles in the lives of the Caesars.
Yeah.
So how are they depicted?
They're depicted very differently in writing, in literature, from how they're depicted in art. In literature, many of them, not all, but many of them, are seen as partly corrupting the emperors. They are a very bad influence. They're often utterly sexually voracious, but they are pulling the strings behind the scenes. I mean, people like Livia, the wife of the Emperor Augustus, who's supposed to have had, many of the young imperial family put to death because she was really trying to get her son Tiberius onto the throne. Or Messalina, who is kind of the worst sex-crazed maniac almost in the history of Rome. And there are stories in literature about her doing, challenging the prostitutes of Rome to a competition to see who could sleep with more men in the same night. And Messalina wins, of course. Now, what's interesting is that is very much a subversive literary view. If you look at art, they are represented very much as venerable, austere, respectable mothers. I mean, so what the artistic representation of Roman women of the imperial family, I still call them empresses, though they're not really. The artistic representation is very much saying these are women who bear the children who become the future emperor. So you've got two very, very different versions. And I've been very interested for a long time in the first version, the idea that women are the bad influence behind the Roman throne, because it does match up with some of the ways that we talk about the wives and mothers of politicians now. I mean, I don't know how much people with you have been following the doings of Boris Johnson, but quite often, just the same way that, or in similar ways, not quite the same way, in similar ways that the Roman imperial women are talked about, Johnson's wife, Carrie Johnson, is repeatedly said to be the one who's a bad influence on him, who chose this too expensive wallpaper that he put up in his flat, that is getting her way from behind the scenes. And I think there's always been a very strong sense that women manipulate their men to get their own way. And that certainly goes back to the Romans.
Great, thank you for that, for this vision. Going back to 12 Caesars, the book's range is immense. You travel far over the time and space, and congratulations for that, because you cannot stop reading the book. It's fabulous.
Thank you. It took me a very long time to write because there was so much work to do.
Which was the most fun part of the book to write or to research? Was there anything that really surprised you?
Yes. I think it was all fun in different ways, but I was very interested in a set of paintings that before I started writing the book, I didn't know about, so it was a great surprise, which is Titian, the famous Venetian artist Titian, portraits of 11 of the 12 Caesars. And these were commissioned for the Gonzaga family at Mantua. They were then brought to England because King Charles I went and sort of got them at a knockdown rate from the Gonzaga in Mantua, and they ended up in Madrid and were sadly destroyed in a great fire at the palace in Madrid in the 18th century. And there was no trace of them, no trace of the original survives. And they've rather kind of fallen out of people's interest, partly, I think, because you can't see them. What I discovered, though, was that there are so many copies that were made before they were destroyed. And there are so many stories of them after they were destroyed, with people claiming that they hadn't been destroyed really, and that some of them had been sighted in the United States of America. And they became a kind of a real cause célèbre, that everybody wanted to know what had happened to Titian's Caesars. And for me, it was an eye-opener in another way too, because I think that most of us, even if we think we don't, most of us have got a vague picture in our mind of what Roman emperors as a lineup looked like. Well, actually, until these were destroyed in the 18th century, it was Titian's vision of emperors that came into people's minds. People in 17th century didn't see Roman emperors like we do, like a kind of lineup of marble busts, which I think is what we think of when we think emperor. They saw them as Titian had recreated them, partly based on ancient sculpture, but partly very up to date for Titian. So they were a wonderful mystery story. But they were also something that I simply hadn't realized about until I worked on the book. So it was a great surprise.
Well, I have two more questions, but important ones.
It's fine.
Towards the close of the book, you reference the sculpture wars of present day, where the status of the statuary in the public sphere is more contested than has been in centuries.
Yeah.
Do you think that some sculptures should come down? What is your vision on sculpture wars?
I think that some should, and they always have. You know, the Romans threw sculptures of emperors they didn't like into the Tiber. They sometimes also, rather more cleverly, re-sculpted, recarved the face so they looked like somebody different. And I think that I think to say no sculpture, no portrait should ever come down, I mean, it's kind of a mad fossilization of art, really. I think, though, that before we, get too enthusiastic about this, I think we ought to think about what portrait sculptures are for, really. And I think that a lot of people, and it's not entirely wrong, a lot of people imagine that you have portraits of these guys around your cities in order to admire them. They're there because they're being heroized. And I think one thing that the 12 Caesars taught me is that you can have sculptures and portraits, real or imaginary, for all kinds of different reasons. There weren't many people in the 18th century who were admiring these Caesars. Most of them were corrupt tyrants, or so they believed. And I think that in many ways, one big function of the portrait is not to admire it, but to make us think harder about it, and sometimes to deplore it, and to remember the people that we used to admire, perhaps, and to remember that one day people will be tearing down portraits of us.
It makes total sense. I totally agree with that. It's not only black and white, and you have a lot of gray areas in between.
Right. There is.
So last year, Howard University announced that it was dissolving its classics department,
really?
A move that punctuates a heated debate about whether Greco-Roman history should be taught differently from the history of other ancient societies. Today, there's a new wave of scholars claiming that classics sustain a mythology of whiteness. And I read a very, very long form piece on the New York Times on that recently. What's your opinion on that?
I think that I partly agree with the opposition. I mean, I partly agree that classics has been instrumental often in supporting white supremacy. I think, however, it's a bit like portraits, really. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, classics has been turned to bad uses. I mean, most academic subjects have been turned to bad uses. Nuclear physics gave us the atomic bomb. Every subject has got its downsides. And I think it's very important for us to recognize the bad uses that's been put to. That doesn't mean destroying the subject. And I think you might also say that classics has been put to some very good uses as well. In the British 19th century, what happened in 5th century Athens was really important in generating new democratic ways of thinking. Towards the end of the 19th century, people looked back when they were wanting to talk about gay rights, and they saw that the ancient world was a place where homosexuality was treated differently from the repressive version in 19th century England. So I think, history, it isn't just for giving us a message about what we like. It's about teaching us about ourselves, and I think helping us to think harder about where we are. And I think classicists, people who study classics, I think they do have to think a bit about the bad uses that classics has been put to, and there have been. I think they should also think a bit about the good uses, and try to make sure that it's better in the future. So I don't think that we should burn it all down.
Professor, thank you very much for the interview. It was a
Well,
nice pleasure to have you here.
It was a great pleasure for me. So thank you very much. Thank you.